This is basically why we're here. For health and safety reasons, we'll be transitioning to cybercrime. The bad guys have figured it out. And it's put us into a really serious situation. I was at a meeting yesterday of National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance, which works with the government and private industry. They're a public-private partnership looking at cybercrime, helping to reduce it. These are numbers from the FBI's Internet Crime Report from 2021, the IC3 report. If you do the math with what's listed there and all, you can kind of, LA alone seems to have about $165 million in reported losses out of the 6.9 billion. California leads the nation with over $1 billion in losses. And these are reported losses. And I asked one of the people at yesterday's meeting who's from IC3, who compiles this, what percentage of cyber crimes actually get reported? In other words, how big is the real number of 6.9 billion reported? And the answer was maybe 10%. So take this number and multiply it by 10, take the $160 million here in LA and multiply that by 10. That's over $1.5 billion just here in LA that's lost to cybercrime. So anything we can do to help navigate that, help businesses navigate that space, the more effective that we become. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at. And it starts with identifying, where are your exposures? Where are the holes in your system, the weaknesses in your system that you have to, work through. So I'm going to start very, first of all, brief introduction of you, and then we'll do the same with the other panelists, then we'll go answer that question. So tell us who you are and welcome. Thanks for being a panelist. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Barry Weber. I'm a partner at Assured SBC and focus personally on, as much as I can, just on privacy, but also act as a VC for small organizations. I've got a history of decades running IT organizations, so I think I've got a unique view of the world from multiple perspectives, and glad to be here today.
Super, Barry. So glad you are. And I'm just going across my screen. Bob, you're first lawyer up. You're next. Great to see you again, as always. Thank you for being a panelist.
Thanks. Nice to see you. Nice to be here. I am Bob Braun. I am a partner at a Century City law firm, although we're statewide. Jeffrey Mangels, Butler and Mitchell. I'm the co-chair of our cybersecurity and privacy group. I do focus quite a bit of my time on privacy and privacy compliance, although I also work on data breaches and helping companies do the planning for adequate and reasonable security and privacy. And it's something that I've actually been doing before there were PCs. So for the last 40 years, I've actually spent a good deal of my time on privacy and security issues for a variety of clients. And it's great to be here.
Super. Glad you're able to join us. And you too, Scott Kohler, another attorney. As I said, we got to get all of those, you saw in the video. We got to get us all together, talking together. And that's a lot of what this is about. So Scott, welcome, and introduce yourself, please.
Absolutely. So I'm a partner in the LA office of Baker Hostetler. I am a privacy and data security attorney, and I spend my practice helping companies and organizations prepare for and respond to security incidents and security breaches. That includes everything from assessing an organization's reasonable security compliance to responding to a data breach investigation, which over the past several years, I've literally helped thousands of clients and customers respond to various security incidents of various types. My background is in information technology. I'm a CISSP and certified computer forensic examiner, in addition to being an attorney. So that helps bridge the gap between the legal world and the tech world, is to be able to speak the same language.
Yeah.
But
cool. It's interesting. On the one side, when I heard you say 1,000, and it was like, cool, that's great business. I mean, I'm a business person, you're a business person. But then you think, wait a minute, why do we have so many cyber crimes that one attorney alone has to, like do 1,000. I mean, that's we got to do better. And I know, Bob, you too. I mean, you're handling this stuff, and your partners at Jeffrey Mangels, the same kind. Alex, you're on the other side. You're an IT person, which means you got one foot in security, and the other foot is you got to keep the systems going, and you got to do it on as little money as your clients, can afford to pay you as well. So introduce yourself and welcome.
Thanks, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm extremely passionate about this topic and honored to be part of this esteemed panel of professionals. So Phoenix 2.0 is a full service IT consulting and management firm. We have kind of a three-legged stool of services. We do managed IT. We do managed cybersecurity because of the importance cybersecurity has gained in recent years. We also do strategic projects and technology staffing. And so our client base, depending on the service we're providing, spans really the upper end of the SMB market, which is the small and medium businesses, lower middle market companies that we do transformation projects for, and then groups within enterprises where we're helping them hire engineers and tech talent. So we have a pretty wide purview on the economy, and cybersecurity is affecting all of those things. I also sit on a couple of nonprofit boards, and so I see the effect that has in the community and the challenges inherent in trying to solve societal issues with having, cyber incidents and data privacy concerns impede that already difficult work. So I think it's great that we're all here talking about how we can make things a little better for everyone. Thank you.
Super. Well, glad you're among the people who are here to talk about this. And the same, I'm Jason Meshko, one of our board members. Jason, again, looks at this thing from an entirely different perspective. It's the insurance, the risk management side of things. And of course, after a breach, insurance can cover some of what that entails, but only a part of it. And Jason, from everything you're telling me, it's getting tougher and tougher out there.
It's very fun, Stan. I enjoy it every day and twice on Sunday. My background, for those of you who don't know me, I think I know most of you that are on this call. I'm the co-founder of InTouch Insurance Services. We're a full service risk management insurance brokerage. We probably handle about 75% of commercial accounts, which is business, small to medium size. We have a niche in IT, MSPs, and we partner with cybersecurity company and law enforcement to do a pre-breach assessment. So you put in reasonable security, which we'll talk about today. And that's basically nebulous because what is reasonable? And we'll discuss that today. Before breach, and then we make sure on the back end we put insurance in place. So if they do get breached, they knew who to go to and proactive, and we're able to facilitate it from A to Z regarding a breach for any type of company. We're licensed in 38 states. So we have a pretty broad spectrum as far across the country. And then we have clients that are overseas, which have their own different exposures regarding data privacy breaches and cybercrime. I also sit on the task force with the United States Secret Service regarding cybercrime and cyber espionage. And I work with them to collaborate with small to medium-sized businesses so they have someone to go to on the citizens or a non-law enforcement side to help them out. So been a board member for 3 years, and I think 3 or 4 years. I've known Stan since 1981. So welcome. Look forward to collaborating with you all. Thanks a lot.
Super. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, it's great to have you and that perspective, a long-term perspective of the industry. Also, our final panelist who's here now, we're going to get another later on, but George Hussey, also on the board of Secure the Village. And George, like me, you're all in on, how do we help organizations operationally secure what their sensitive information and so on. So please welcome and introduce yourself there as well.
Yes, good morning. Almost good afternoon for those of you that are on the East Coast. It's definitely good afternoon. I'm George Hussey. If those haven't met me before, first, my last name is kind of tricky. People forget it. So here's a way to remember it. If you see hackers, you see Hussey. So none of you will ever forget how to pronounce my last name. So we'll start with that. I'm George Usey. I'm one of the board members for Secure the Village. I also am on the board for the California IPv6 Task Force chairman and the Greater North American IPv6 Task Force, another not-for-profit. It's going to sound silly. We're upgrading the internet. Yeah. So, but that is the that is essentially what that other organization does. And what's always been top of mind is the challenge of we call cyber stability, and the idea of some norms within cyber security fall within that realm. There's actually a group that is putting together a digital UN right now, kind of a concept, which is a big part of securing the village. Think of it as my involvement with Secure the Village came to fruition through my company, which that's how I pay my bills, a company called OmniStruct. And we're in the cyber risk management business. We work with quite a few privacy attorneys throughout mostly the US. But my involvement with Secure the Village that journey began when I met Stan relatively recently by other people's comparison. That was about 3 years ago, I believe, Stan. And my mindset and my vision throughout much of my career was to figure out how to keep sensitive data sacred. How do we do that? You know, besides having cybersecurity for availability, it's also there for what essentially is confidentiality and integrity purposes, for those of you that know the CIA triad. But the meaning behind that, these are not just words, these are serious attributes and mindset. And so, you know, ultimately, what we recognized in my experience working on IPv6 and global backbones and those sorts of things, I started my career at NTT, Docomo, and we realized that a lot of the work that we did in developing the internet backbone in the 90s was really focused on keeping the backbone secure, but keeping everything else neutral and open and free. And we kind of look back at that and go, we didn't do the greatest job taking care of the businesses and the users that actually use the internet when it comes to cybersecurity. So we wrote this great set of governance Bibles of internet, essentially the internet infrastructure and architecture. And so now we're kind of doing that today, kind of trying to solve that problem. And Secure the Village is really that essence of what we believe needs to be a people-centered or community-centered effort. So every region's cybersecurity dynamics, every village has its unique attributes. And so if you're not working together as a community, there's going to be less success on the global stage with some of the governance and the standards and the things that are coming out. And that is really kind of the essence of what I saw with Secure the Village and why I agreed to be part of the board. So I'm happy to be here and excited to see so many people in attendance today.
Super. George, thanks so much. I'm glad you are here. Let me also just before we jump in, once again, say thank you to first our platinum sponsor, Miller Kaplan, the Bay Area IT Group, which Alex represents, innovation for the benefit of humankind. Also, Alex, thanks for bringing all of that to us. And the privacy and law and cybersecurity section of the California Lawyers Association as a partner. Scott, thank you for that as well. And all right, so let's jump in with the question that I asked before I bothered to introduce all of you, which is, shame on me. I jumped ahead of my own agenda. But independent of that, Barry, let me let you jump in, because I know you kind of see the world from this kind of looking at it from the privacy security perspective. And what do you see? What are the threats out there, the major things that are going on?
I personally think that the biggest threats are not so much the outside world, but what organizations are not doing for themselves. That's the real challenge. I mean, clearly, organizations are in general, highest rated threats are BEC and phishing and those things that can create financial risk associated with organization or loss of intellectual property. But at the end of the day, they say the biggest challenge is that it's a challenge for every organization to do what is some definition of sufficient. to protect themselves. And because of that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that we are threatened because we don't know how to balance risk. And that's a business leader issue. Every business leader has to deal with risks to the organization from lots of different attack surfaces or threats. You know, it could be legal compliance, it could be potential issues associated with revenue, and they have to balance that against, oh, by the way, I've got to fund cybersecurity risk remediation as well. And it's the biggest challenge isn't so much what's in the outside, it's how do we come up with the answer to this question, what's reasonable?
Mhm.
And reasonable comes down to a combination of balancing what's a threat to the business, what's a threat to the business in terms of delivering to its customers, and what's a threat to others that could be impacted by the business.
Yeah, that's right. And that's looking at it from that perspective, that high level perspective is one of the things I think that's absolutely vital, that we help business owners, business leaders, boards, CISOs and CIOs and all understand. Aligned or alongside of that, coming in at ground level are things like, you know, ransomware and cyber extortion and business email compromise and all of those kind of attacks, if you will. Alex, what are you seeing ground level with your clients, the attacks, and then the successes of the attacks or the failures of the attacks to be successful, which is, of course, what we want. How's that world changed over the last couple of years?
Okay, let me take that in two parts. And so I knock on wood, I have to say with our clients, we've had a really good track record, primarily because we've been pushing reasonable security as we interpret it, as I think as many of us do here, for a long time. I can tell you personally that in 2017, when we had that year with NotPetya and WannaCry, those two massive global incident outbreaks, I knew that things were not going to be the same moving forward, because I said to myself, God forbid this happens to one of our clients, right? So that was a total game changer. Conversations prior to that point, when IT was talking about risk with clients, it was about downtime and equipment failure and all kinds of other things. And then all of a sudden, that conversation was compounded by external threat actor being able to take your environment down for weeks at a time, and you have really very little control over your ability to restore. So it just completely changed the conversation. From a practical standpoint, I can tell you, I talk to a lot of prospective clients who are in the middle of some kind of an incident and reach out to us because they don't even know the difference between, whether we should call an IT firm in the middle of an incident, should we call a cybersecurity company, should we call our insurer, should we call an attorney? And that's one of the key questions in the middle of an incident, right? So they call us, and I can tell you a lot of this stuff, as Barry mentioned, and some of us, the other folks mentioned, starts with email-based threats. I mean, I think as a percentage, if you look at the Verizon Data Breach Report and Ponemon Institute and all these folks that gather this data, email and just the propensity for users to click on things, right, and fall for fairly simple social engineering attacks, I think that accounts for a large majority of it. Then the rest of it is stolen credentials, right? And then, that being a pretext for some kind of an attack or an attempt at an attack. And then there's other things that are more sophisticated where, clients don't have firewalls, right? Now they're working from home. Those internet connections are not secure. So you've got, again, things coming into their inbox and people clicking on things. So, our purview is that most of our clients are not being attacked by nation states or advanced persistent threat actors. It's the cyber crime groups globally that are causing a nuisance. And a lot of the stuff they're attempting is not very sophisticated, but it's successful, right? And it's a numbers game for them. So as somebody mentioned, I think we're just in our infancy in being able to even deal with the kind of the most basic threats, unfortunately. So, but I'm sure we'll talk about how we can all do that better. There are really some very simple things that are, as part of reasonable security, essential controls. I think we would all agree as essential controls, and a lot of them are pretty easy to implement. So, yeah, that's good. And so what you brought up is a segue, Jason, back to you, because
You and Bob and Scott are the people who get called after the event happens, after the incident happens. You know, in particular, I want my I got insurance, you know. What are you, how have the incidents, the numbers of incidents and the seriousness of incidents changed on your end over the last couple of years? How many more incidents are you seeing? I mean, in the old days that you had, I'll make up the numbers, you know, 0.1% of your customers over the course of a year would have a security incident, and now it's 3%. I mean, let's hope it's not that high. But how are you seeing that change happening?
Well, I'll answer that question in a second. Our goal is to be proactive.
Yeah.
So the companies that we work with, we put in the best practices or reasonable security, however cliche you want to use, before a breach happens. So
Yeah,
they know who to call.
And
So
we'll get
that's
there later. Yeah, we'll come
Yeah,
back.
we'll get there later, but
Yeah.
that's the goal. To
Sure.
answer your question, we had about 5 or 6 clients that got breached. One denial of service and probably about 3 or 4 ransomwares before COVID.
Mhm.
After that, we're probably over 100. You know, we
to 100.
Yes, easily 100. We have a lot of social engineering. A lot of very challenged individuals that keep clicking links, and the next thing you know, they wire $1 million to the bad guys. We have my partner Ayers, a lot of you guys know Ayers. He has a pretty big book of business of entertainment accounts, and those are a unique set of qualities to deal with because of the industry, quote unquote. Several of the clients had about 5 or 6 within a 6-week period of movie scripts, of wiring money, that type of thing, and production companies. And we try to go ahead and put the best practices in there and get the professionals in there to help them before. And they had coverage. You know, they have coverage on a crime policy with an endorsement, it's pretty technical. So it wasn't a straightaway cyber liability policy, but yeah, we're over 100. A lot of people love to click. A lot of people are getting emails. You know, Stan says that your security is not up to snuff. Click here to go ahead and get a new password or whatever. And they're more creative, the bad actors, if you want to use that word. So it's a systemic issue.
Yeah. Wow. I had not realized your numbers had gone right from
Oh yeah.
6 or so up to that.
Yeah, and we're a
Yeah.
we're a boutique agency. We're just under 3 million in revenue. We've hired a bunch of producers in the the Northwest, and one in New York and in Denver. But it's just a lot of people are getting hit. Low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. And even as Bob, you and Scott are there on the front end as well, you know, let's get stuff in place. Scott, I'm going to jump to you first. What are you seeing? I mean, you do a lot of the forensics. You've got that background in forensics.
Absolutely.
How are you seeing that shift over the last year or so?
So absolutely. So we at Baker Hostetler, we deal with thousands of breach investigations every year. I deal with anywhere from 200 to 300 breach investigations. So we do have quite a bit of insight, and we put together our own annual report. Those numbers show the types of threats that our clients are seeing. 80% of all matters can fall into a network intrusion or phishing. It's about 56% network intrusion and 24% phishing. And over this past year, that's really the first time that network intrusion has bypassed or overtaken phishing as a #1 cause of data breaches. I attribute that primarily to the much wider distribution of MFA and adoption of MFA, which has gone a long way to helping on the phishing side, but still network intrusion, credential compromise, compromising of remote access tools still is, again, the vast majority of the matters that we're seeing. If we translate that into, because I think what we talked about was actual losses. How does that translate into losses to the organization? I could talk direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs, we're talking, your average forensic investigation varies by industry, but it's usually around $60,000 at a minimum.
Let's hold the cost of financial stuff to the next section.
Sorry.
We'll focus directly on costs. I want more here to get more to paint the picture of what the intrusions are looking like, how people are ready for them, how that's changed over the last several years. And we'll come to what all that costs in that next section. But Bob, I want to jump over to you now. Same kind of a question. I mean, you're obviously, you and Scott purposefully are panelists because you're in very different markets, and so we get different perspectives from that as well. When I say different markets, I know, Bob, did so much of your work is hospitality based, and you've got like a real specific expertise there. And how's the hospitality? How's all this changing the hospitality? What's how's cybercrime? How are your calls?
Not enough. The issue, I think that the hospitality industry. Well, first of all, let me say that I do want to agree with what I talked about before. But one thing that you talked about, everyone mentioned briefly, was business email compromise. And, I think that when I look at this on the losses, I'm looking at the models, the business models behind them. Business email compromise is a great business model. It works really well. It requires less work, and the results are almost immediate. And unless Jason tells me otherwise, business email compromise is not going to get covered by well, I don't know. It's difficult to get covered by insurance. It also is different from a lot because basically banks say too bad. Banks, title companies, others have done with it. I think that hotels are struck. There continue to be a lot of ransomware and intrusion into hotels. The reason is that hotels, like school districts and hospitals, have certain things in common. They have lots of points of entry. There's a lot of website traffic. There are a lot of ways to get into the system simply by using the website. If the companies, and particularly, there are companies like Hilton and Marriott who have been struck multiple times, and they have enormous security budgets. They have 9-figure security budgets. Imagine what a smaller company gets, because they don't have those kind of things, but they have a problem of they don't necessarily have good segmentation or transparency in their systems. They do not have good training. The turnover in the hospitality industry, like the turnover in healthcare and others, is very, very high, and training for cybersecurity is very poor. And as was mentioned here before, I always like to say biggest risk in security is the object that intrudes between the screen and the back of the chair. It's a human factor issue. So that's one thing in the hospitality area. They have that. And the other thing is that hospitality is struck a lot because they have extremely high value information. It's not just financial information. That's sort of, credit card information is fine. That's on the illicit market, that's a short shelf life and not particularly, it's good, okay in volume, but it's not great. But they do have a lot of personal information, which then leads to the ability to do spoofing, leads back to the business email compromise, leads back to being able to obtain credentials and move laterally within a system. So when I look at this, the number of times when we've looked at breaches, and everyone says, where did it happen? We look back to it very often. We believe that it was because of that there's a connection to the hospitality industry, even if it wasn't a hotel breach.
Yeah, interesting.
By the way, I have to throw in something but I think Alex may have said, is that if there's any question, the first person you call is your lawyer. I think I'm not, it's not, Scott in the room, Scott's smiling. It's not because we feel emotionally that we ought to be called first because it's important to us. But it's important to the victim because when a victim is hit with one of these problems, somebody's got to be the quarterback and somebody has to preserve a privilege for the inevitable lawsuit. So that's why you call the lawyer. We don't hide things, we get people involved.
Yeah, I hear that regularly, and not just from lawyers, even sometimes from from insurance people. But it's always that challenge. Who do you call? I guess the pure answer from the operations perspective is don't struggle with that question when the breach occurs. Know who you're going to call before the breach. Already call them and say, hey, we're going to call you if we get breached. And I see Barry, you're nodding your head just before we go, Alex. Well, no, Alex, go ahead. Yeah, you got your hand raised. Yeah. But you're muted.
Apologies. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add something, and I hope I'm not piling onto an already kind of painful subject. But attribution is really hard in cybersecurity, and the reality is that cyber insurance don't want to necessarily cover the costs of you trying to get to the root cause of an issue that isn't really in their interest. And so we often are left, as IT people, having to then come into an environment after a breach and clean up, replace devices and stand things back up, and then talk to the client about how do we keep this from happening again. It's hard if we don't know real attribution and real root cause, because there are so many vulnerabilities in the environment. Anybody's guess is as good as as ours of what the actual cause is. So that's part of my frustration sometimes. And I think that again leads to the only thing you can do is do reasonable security, and then you then have a leg to stand on and say, look, we were mapping to CIS 18. We're doing all of the controls that are relevant to our environment. Something did happen, but we were on a pretty solid footing as far as our security posture. And I think that is maybe the one way to deal with the sometimes lack of not knowing what actually happened. So
yeah, good point. Which is a segue to you, George, on that, because you're in there advising your clients and all around the security structure and all, and you see this stuff happening as well. First, what are the changes you're seeing, and how does that impact the whole rest of the conversation we're having?
Great question. So the big change that we see is in line with what happened in history more than 100 years ago. This is not unique, what we're experiencing here. And so I'm going to ask you to put in the frame of your mind the concept that hackers are arsonists as well as thieves. So and the concept that we are essentially lacking a cyber fire department that can respond to incidents. Because what's interesting is that if you do have a crime occurring and risk of life is life is at stake, you're probably going to call the police, right? So, and there's no charge. It's a free service. They come out, essentially free. So there's some concepts behind what happened in firefighting 100 years ago, right? When you used to fight fires, the analogy there is that first, when firefighting happened, you used to have to pay the first fire department that showed up to put the fire out in your house. And that's how you took care of fires. And then insurance companies got involved, and you'd pay the insurance company, and then the fire department would come out, and then the insurance company would pay them. And then it went to what we have today, which is a public service. The question is that feasible or reasonable in this similar, because that's really where we're at now, right? Is that you call your IT company, as your first responder for anything with a blinking light. That's what you're used to. That's what you've been doing for 50 years. But the challenge is that cybersecurity has evolved into a cyber risk situation. And it's got very little to do with tech, and very much so to do with, what essentially is business information security, which is, I think, why we have the evolution of the BISO. If none of you have heard of that, there is a business information security officer position evolving in every single large enterprise, rather than a CISO alone. And so when you start to see that division, what you like to think of, and the best way to think of it, is that the victim is kind of like the executive branch of the government. The supporting IT company or any of the helpers are like Congress. Now the judicial branch is coming in to balance it all out. And that's what cyber risk is. So your IT firm, in this case, in Alex's example, is the cybersecurity ground war fighter. But there's a good chance that their technicians are not going to be able to really understand how to respond effectively, as somebody like Robert would come back or Scott would come back and say, no, these are the helpers that you need and when you need them. And so, but what's interesting is that that's at need. What about before? And what about after the restoration services, right? After the attack, right? These are all things that are going to be evolving. And so we talk about what's changing. This other thing that, remember, we've been fighting this ground war of cybersecurity for years. An air war has been added. And that air war is got a lot to do with what Jason in insurance and Scott and Robert in legal. And there's also a tremendous gap and issues in audit as well, which is what OmniStruct does. These things are going to be necessary continuously. Things like integrity monitoring will evolve. Right. So if you want to know where the market is headed and know where as Wayne Gretzky used to say, the reason I'm so successful, I go to where the puck is going to be, not where the puck is. You have to be aware of how those changes are evolving. And I don't know if it was Gartner, Fortune, some major magazine, I can't remember, Stan, maybe you remember, there was an announcement that cyber risk is moving, the CIO and IT is going to lose control over cybersecurity because it's going to end up in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an eye-opener for where are things headed. So by forecasting by 2025, 2026, tech will no longer be essentially leading or controlling cybersecurity, at least at the large enterprise level. Mm-hmm. And that there have even been calls to eliminate your IT departments and move all your IT departments to different branches of your business. So they think IT is too siloed. Whether those things happen or not, and how we read the tea leaves of what's happening, you can look back to history to see what's probably going to happen. Maybe we will have a cyber fire department that small businesses call. Yeah. And your local police department, who is cyber response trained, handles it.
Yeah.
Who knows? But if you look back to history, there's the parallel, right? So it's happened once before. Will IT service providers be able to rely on some future cyber fire department kind of a concept? We do know that recently CISA or CISA, depending upon how you pronounce it in the past, was somewhat blessed by some internet scientists as our national cyber fire department. And so, is Secure the Village really, as an organization, when we look at this problem, right? How are we preparing our community? Are we preparing our community for this? And so there's work to be done, and there's some decisions to be made within greater metropolitan statistical areas, because that's probably how it'll be organized. Mm-hmm. So when you ask about what's coming, that's what I see. Whether it's 5 or 10 years out, probably a lot longer than that for the actual cyber fire department to happen. So
yeah.
So for now, it's insurances and IT vendors dealing with cyber attacks, but now we have to deal with the before and after components. And so that's one of the reasons cyber risk is being identified as one of the largest growing industries within enterprise risk management, and also where a lot of the gaps are, like finding a privacy attorney who's got a CISSP and has backbone experience and understands how the internet works thoroughly is like trying to find a rainbow colored unicorn. It's so you have service providers as well, the AT&Ts, right? Those are the ones who hire those guys, right? So yeah. And so it goes beyond just the security. What about the tech and the fundamental concepts of how all of the IETF documentation and the internet architecture itself works? And so the problem is bigger than you can even imagine it. But enterprises and businesses that are in a region, they don't need to think about or care about what backbone companies are doing, what service providers are doing, what's happening in that respect. They have to do their own job, and it's a very regional and community focused job, and thus Secure the Village is here.
Yeah, no, good points across there. And it's, well, first on the volunteer fire department, I see all of us, whether we know it or not, are members of a volunteer cyber department, because we're out there, both in pre-need and post-need. doing, I mean, here today being an illustration of all of that. So we've talked, and I don't want to spend much time on this, just a couple of minutes, if one or two of you maybe have a thought. To what, and maybe I'll point it directly to you, Alex, on your side, and then maybe take one of the attorneys. To what extent, Alex, are your clients aware of these challenges, and they're coming to you and saying, hey, Alex, we need you to do blah, 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 or we need you to make sure we're secure, blah, 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 whatever they mean by that, versus to what extent are you having to educate your clients and help them understand why they need to do these things, which is, it's a supply demand kind of question. What's that look like in your world?
Yeah, great question, Stan. Again, I have to kind of segment the answer by customer size and vertical. So I can tell you that increasingly now people are getting third-party questionnaires. Small nonprofits in San Francisco are getting questionnaires from the city because they work with the city or receive city funding for certain programs. And their response is, how do we comply with this and get past this so we can continue with day-to-day business? They really are not looking at cyber risk writ large as this kind of a strategic endeavor that they need to handle. Obviously, some larger clients, for-profit entities, especially ones in regulated industries, are much more mature around their understanding of cyber risk. And like you said, it could be a great business development tool. For example, I'm helping two creative agencies now try to win business with Twitter and Airbnb, but they have to pass, answer a security questionnaire successfully, right? And if they take too long to answer, if they don't answer satisfactorily, or they can't come back with answers to follow-up questions, that's going to impede their ability to win these deals. So it really depends on the customer, but there's still a lot of resistance, even though people's hand is being forced to do some security. We're kind of having to still drag them along. It's only the larger customers that are embracing this as, okay, it is what it is. Let's get in front of this and let's turn this into a competitive advantage. So
yeah, interesting. Bob, what are you seeing with your clients?
I think so most of my clients, it's really a budgeting issue. If they have experienced a breach or an incident, or if they have or if they've seen a breach by an incident that relates to a company they know well, one of their competitors or one of their vendors or something like that, their level of awareness and their interest in addressing the issue, security, goes way up. However, for most of our clients, they are only now beginning to put real budgeting and budgeting and governance behind security, and that's really the issue. I mean, that I don't think, and by the way, I think what Alex just said is absolutely true. Sometimes, very often, it's because their insurance company, they won't get insurance unless they deal with it. Very often, we are now seeing business partners like banks and others and key customers who are becoming very, very intrusive in their review of policies, procedures, and systems. And so it's really, I'd say that, no one wakes up in the morning and says, gosh, I really want to be secure. I want to create a secure environment. I think what happens is somebody says, oh, I have to. When I was a young lawyer, I realized that people rarely do things on their own initiative. They generally do things by compulsion. And I think this is a key area where compulsion is what drives it. Yeah. So I mean, it's like more of the above, but unless someone has a personal experience with it, or unless someone is forced to, like they have been under Graham Leach Bliley or under HIPAA or under, frankly, we're trying to explain to people that they have to do it under the CCPA to avoid the private right of action under the CCPA. And unless they really are forced to do it, or somehow they have this come to Jesus moment. Sorry if I offended anybody. Then or come to whoever moment. Then they're not doing it.
Interesting, fascinating. So in a moment, I'm going to open it up to Q&A discussion. So if you want to do that, raise your hand, which is one of the buttons down below. It's under, if you go to reactions, you can raise your hand there. But before we do that, I want to, Jason, same question to you in terms of, are more companies coming to you and saying, hey, we want to get insurance? Or are you still, this is an offering, would you like it? And they're, well, I'm not sure. How's that shifted over the last,
Yeah, it's 50-50. They're still on the fence. We have a CYA letter that we send out. And that letter is really basically, hey, we're proposing X, Y, and Z. If you don't have cyber, we're going ahead and recommending it. And if you don't want it, then you have to sign it. We had a situation where a client declined it and they got attacked, and they had a little general liability insurance endorsement on it and gave them limited amount of coverage. I think they got paid out $30,000 or $40,000 for another social engineering or a wire transfer. And they came to us, oh, you didn't offer us. I said, well, you signed the letter and we have an email. So that's not going to hold up in court. So I don't know what you want to do. So to answer your question is it's some prodding. I probably run into 60% of new business that I get in, that I get referred in, that has challenges and they don't have cyber.
mm-hmm.
They have nothing. They're not talking to anybody. They have no reasonable security. They have a guy or a girl, that's their IT vendor, and it goes on from there. So, you know, people just don't understand it. And these are multi-million dollar companies.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at $70-80 million, you know, annual revenue companies, and they don't have any policy in place for reasonable security or best practices. They don't have an IT really vendor that's in-house, and they don't work with any MSPs, and they have no insurance. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess kind of what I would expect, and I've been looking at the chat log, which is beginning to fill up, which is nice, because yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on the insurance side.
Yeah, the insurance is, you know, it's funny. I mean, we can get into it later on, but I don't know how many of you know TRIA, Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, and what it covers. I'm not going to go a deep dive on that, but that was a response to 9/11, and Congress passed it in 2002. Where you have domestic terrorism versus foreign terrorism, and how the insurance companies postured on that. I do think there's going to be, and we had a roundtable up in Sacramento last week. George was there. We were talking about not a state sponsored, but a federal cyber program like the flood insurance or Terrorism Risk Insurance Act that basically will go ahead and fill the gap, because there's going to be a huge vacuum with these companies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody's at war right now. Rob and I were chatting on the side regarding Lloyd's in London. The carriers are posturing to that. You know, you're reading certain material, and then real world might be a little bit different, because you can get an endorsement that can carve back an exclusion. It gets technical. But at the end of the day, you have to go ahead and find out what the client's needs are and what their tolerant of risk is.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yesterday at the meeting I was at with the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance, and you know, a lot of attorneys, a lot of managed detection and response and intrusion technology companies and bankers, and it was geared towards CISOs and attorneys, were the two main groups. And one of the things they talked about was that CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is working in this space to consider what might the federal government do.
They're gonna have to do something. They're gonna have to do
exactly.
something. And George and I were talking about last week in Sacramento. They're gonna have to do something like TRIA. I'm not gonna go into TRIA, but Google what TRIA is and how it's an add-on onto your policies. But this is why we do the educational events, Stan. This is why we educate and get the clients. We collaborate with Secure the Village. Proceeds, you know, I put it onto the chat because it's education, and then from there. And and that's it. That, you know, Hillard's going to be there, George is going to be there, so everybody's coming in the next couple of weeks, And that's what it's about. So
Yeah.
anyways, I will get off my soapbox.
I doubt that, just temporarily. We know each other too well. We need you on that soapbox. It's again, I'll open it up if there are any questions from any of the panel of the Scott. Talk to us about reasonableness in the law.
Oh, okay. We were answering questions about what is reasonable security and trying to get back to the basics of what it was. And really where I started from and where this language of reasonable security is coming from is various state statutes. Here in California, it's California Civil Code 1798.81.5. It varies in other states, but here in California, that's where it's cited. And it requires a business that owns, licenses, or maintains personal information to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices appropriate to the nature of the information to protect that personal information from unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, or disclosure. Okay, and the point I was trying to make is that inevitably this is a legal issue. It is a legal issue that's at the crossroads of various technical concerns, but it's a legal issue, and because of that, reasonableness is not defined in the statute. Just the way it's very much dependent on the circumstances, the nature of the information, and as well as the nature of the organization protecting it. What sort of resources does that organization have? What is the size of that information? So that's really, I think, at a fundamental point where this idea of maintaining reasonable security comes from.
Yeah, no, I think well said. And I'm going to ask Bob you to jump in on that as well, because at its fundamental apex, it becomes a legal question, particularly in the face of lawsuits and breach disclosures and all of California Consumer Privacy Act, et cetera. And we haven't even talked about GDPR. Bob, jump in on
Yeah,
that.
I think, well, first of all, I think Scott said it very well. I mean, it's one of the few parts of the California statute that is, intelligible, but at the bottom line, it doesn't give a lot of guidance. It's obvious because it says it's up to you. It basically says you figure it out. You, the business, you, the consumer, whoever you are, you figure out whether you have adequate security. On the other hand, there are a lot of guidelines. There may be too many guidelines. For example, there's NIST, and NIST is coming up with, both privacy and security guidelines, and they're very extensive. I worked on the one for the hospitality industry, 800 pages long, and I mean, just to get through it is a huge issue, but ultimately, Alex, I just saw this pop up. I think the statute is 1798.81.5, if I'm not mistaken.
You get an A+, Mr.
Thank
Braun.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can tell what Scott and I do for a living, okay? And it ain't pretty. But I'd say that even and there's ISO and there are all sorts of other guidelines. In the end, and I think one of the things that's been mentioned here is what you really have to do is you have to understand your system, whether you're a sole practitioner, whether you're a sole proprietor, or whether you're a large business. The first thing you've got to do, the only way to get to reasonable security is understand what data you collect, where it's held, who has access to it, and what you use it for. The second step is you look at all that and say, what data do I really need? Because if you're collecting data you don't need, you've just created liability and you've potential insecurity, and you can already limit yourself by limiting yourself to what you have, and then say, I collected this before. Irina, you're an accountant. There's stuff you're gonna keep for a long time, tax returns, things like that. But decide what you collect, and then you can go to the point saying, well, where do I keep it? How do I have access to it? How other people have access to it? And after that, it's a matter of being careful. It's a matter of training yourself and training everyone who has potential access to your system, not as my partner Mike Gold always used to say, you learn how not to touch a hot stove. Okay. I mean, I'm really dumbing it down a lot, but the bottom line is, this is the same advice I give to everybody, is find out what you have, what you use it for, who has access to it. And once you have those things, the idea of how you create security becomes a lot simpler.
Yeah.
I think another part of that challenge, well, the concept of data minimization is what we call it, right? Minimize the amount of data, right? The challenge in the IT world and service provider world in general, we saw what essentially was something similar during the backup days, when backups like, oh, we got to back it up in case we lose a drive. And so the first thing that came out in the market were tools that you would pick what files, because it was so expensive for storage, right? So you'd pick files. And then you tell everybody, the IT department would tell, okay, this is where you put the files you want backed up, and no one would do it. And so you'd get hammered as an IT person because data would get lost because the behavior was an issue, the person wasn't following directions. And so what did we do? Just back the whole damn thing up. The opposite of data minimization, right? And so that mindset of IT today, like just back it all up, right? All of a sudden we're being told, no, you can't do that anymore. So because of data minimization, requirements or suggestions. And so I can see it repeating again, where all of a sudden we're trying to minimize data, and then you have user behavior that doesn't follow in line with data minimization objectives. But the difference this time should be that there are these regulatory impacts and sanctions, because before we didn't really have support from the executive team, right? IT was not really well respected comparatively from a cultural perspective by the organization. So that part of the equation of achieving data minimization, that gets tossed. It's going to get tossed over the fence to IT. Okay, guys, you go solve this problem, right?
And that's just the wrong. That's the wrong place for it. I mean, no offense to IT. The IT people, the IS people have very specific roles. But, for instance, I am always arguing with marketing people said, why are you collecting this data?
Right. No,
why do you do it? And it's enshrined in the GDPR, it's enshrined in the CCPA, it's enshrined, it's a basic privacy concept, it's data minimization. And, it all starts with the business end of it. It's their issue. It's a governance issue. Yeah. It's not a technical issue.
You're preaching to the choir, right?
I know. Sorry.
But what you always
but at least you guys will sing with me. Okay.
Right? What you end up with, this is a cultural issue within IT and within organizations as well, is you end up with IT people are helpers. I can do it, boss. I can do it. I'll figure it out. Anything with a blinking light, throw it at the fence to me. That's the challenge, is that there needs to be some degree of cultural education. It goes back to training and making sure that business units know that they're accountable. Who's the data owners? Who's collecting the data? Who's responsible for minimizing the intake of the data? And I think that's where the biggest challenge is in the mid and small markets, is that we're nowhere near that sophisticated in terms of the mindset and the culture, and it's going to take years for that to be effective. And so,
I'd like to add something to this. Those are really good practices, and the governance is really strong as a concept. The biggest challenge that we see in the privacy space is that we're seeing more than 50% of personal information is in unstructured data, in email, in Google Drive, and Dropbox, and OneDrive. And IT has no concept of what's there. There is no structure for governance associated with it. And that's growing much faster than structured data. It's not in the databases. It's in email. And the assumption that understanding what data you have without being able to scan it is not reasonable.
Mm-hmm. How does that play out in ground level, Alex, with your work, with your clients?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, to add to what Barry's saying, the surface of data, the data sprawl. Now we've got sensors and IoT and all this stuff. We really are talking unstructured, right? So, I mean, and I think that's part of the problem is the problem is exponentially increasing while our solutions and our ability to address it is not growing as fast. We're shoveling against the tide, to use an analogy, right?
I would take exception with that. I think the capability is there. The problem is it's expensive. I mean, we implement automated scanning of data to understand what data is there, and we can know up to the minute whether or not personal information is there and who is covering and so forth. But the problem with automated scanning is that it's not inexpensive.
It's not. And think about the decision-making process for that solution to get approved, right? For a client, it's got to go either to the CMO or some kind of a business stakeholder who understands the use case, right, and what's happening. And then maybe the client may not have the wherewithal to do this, so then they need a vendor to come in, right? They're talking to Barry or myself. And that's just one piece of the equation, right? So if you think about having a data management program, a data map exercise, all these kinds of things, the amount of conversations that have to go on for something like that to get approved, this is challenging, right?
My fear, we're getting a little bit too flux capacitor here, as I like to say. We're getting into the weeds. But I think the point is that it's going to always go back, in my opinion, this is my opinion now, that it's going to go back to your counsel, it's going to go back to your legal counsel, period. Because they're the ones that have to tell the CEO, you need to change how the perception, you need to change training, right? You have to cascade it down, right? You can't just toss it over the fence like you did everything else to IT or to security analysts and pretend like you're not technical and say, I don't understand it. You have to lead it. And so my question to Robert and Scott is, what's the formula to convince the C-suite and the board to lead this problem, just as they'll lead every other problem in marketing and finance when they have issues, rather than doing the typical, it's tech, I don't get it, and tossing it over the fence to the CIO without actually leading it? What's the answer? What do you tell them?
Well, I'm going to say one thing, and then let's suggest Scott talk. But I would say I define clients as people who do not follow my advice. So when you say it's up to legal, that's great, but they're not listening to me. But I've been yakking a lot, Scott.
Yeah. So how do you get them to pay attention? The best way, I think there's a couple of ways. First and foremost is you have to state it in terms of laws, and laws are typically enforced through regulatory investigations, fines, assessments, and penalties. The other way it's enforced is pure litigation costs or business costs. So that's how you get them to treat things seriously. The whole reason why so many of these organizations have had their come to Jesus moment is because they have seen their peer companies hit with class action lawsuits, or worse, they've seen them hit with ransomware, and they've seen multi-million-dollar payouts. Okay, and that's translating directly to the bottom line and translating directly to a tangible cost that affects the organization and basically costs them money. And if it doesn't cost them money, or there's some sort of risk or exposure, then they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the answer is clear. I think Scott hit the nail on the head. So period. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
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 I think that's and by the way, I mean, that's when there was the case of the Uber case that recently came out. When a CEO or a business owner or a stakeholder understands that this could impact them personally, they will sometimes wake up. But it has to be very graphic. And I will actually throw one other thing out. I mean, I like IT people. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is having some technical knowledge, not geek eggs, but some technical knowledge. It has to be explained in a way that a user understands. The issues have to explain that way, not on a technical basis. So.
Yeah, this is something I'll jump in on that. The head of CISA talks about this regularly. We have got to ungeek the conversation, the dialogue. I want to jump to Arena's question back. We talked about, Barry, I think it was you who raised the difference between structured and unstructured data, and Irene asked, how does that change the risk? What's that look like? And Bob, I see you've answered it.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's a non-issue. I mean, unstructured data is hard to handle. It's hard to find. It's hard to limit. It's hard. I mean, we haven't gotten to one of the big questions issues we have is in compliance with the CCPA, the individual data requests, the individual rights requests. You've got to deal with unstructured data. If someone says, I want to correct my data, or I want to see my data, or I want to delete it. And if you don't know where it is, you can't, then you're, aside from the fact that if someone gets, we've had breaches where people have exclusively gotten into email systems, and there's been tremendous amounts of information, and explaining those, creating some kind of narrative around those. I mean, we deal with a lot of data breaches that are not, retail breaches. They're business to business breaches. Lots of defense contractors and financial providers and things like that. And we're talking about, their biggest customers. And they're asking, so explaining the narrative is and keeping the business is very difficult.
Yeah.
If I can build onto that, so it comes down to two issues. Number one is when you have unstructured data, it substantially increases the cost of reviewing that data in the event of a data breach. So you have the direct cost right off the bat of you have a breach of an email system. That email system has 30 to 40 gigabytes of data. You're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars having to review that to determine what was at risk and to do notifications. The other area where it comes up is the fact that if you have a ton of unstructured data, you don't know what you have, and you're not able to implement a proper retention program. A retention program is designed to reduce the amount of risk that you have. So that, for example, you're not keeping 30 years worth of data that you don't need and don't have a reasonable basis for it just because hard drives are cheap. You're only keeping the data that you have, and maybe that's a year's worth of data. So now when there's a data breach, instead of it impacting 30 years worth of data, it's maybe only 1 year worth of data. And that's how but you can't really do that if you don't know what you have or where it's stored, or you're just storing everything. So those are the two ways in which not dealing with unstructured data can reduce your risk.
Yeah. Alex, what are you seeing on that issue with your clients?
So I just to maybe tie it back to your last question, Stan. So I kind of failed to answer with specifics. And so some of the things, when, for example, how do we encounter this data sprawl, right? So clients come to us and where we sit down and have a quarterly business review meeting or some kind of the business of IT meeting. And we look at, for example, we revisit backups, right? And we look, we're going to revisit the backup schema. Why are we backing this up? Do we still need this? Should we be backing this up? Should we maybe archive this? Can this stuff get purged, right? So revisiting the data governance strategy at that time. And then that's a good time to also advocate for them to talk to Barry or a privacy expert about data mapping. Are they in scope for regulatory privacy things? Should they be ingesting this data? That's a good time to revisit that. Also, in doing an architectural review, clients often have instances that they've turned on that they're not using. All kinds of interconnects or API access. I mean, where, again, data mapping will help understand where some of this stuff is coming from. And then so sort of inventorying those assets, right? So it's infrastructure cleanup, accounts that have been turned on that have privileged access that nobody really knows what they're there for anymore, right? Or service accounts of all types. That IT maintenance is really helpful with that part of it. But there's still a chasm, I think, where IT ends and, let's say, like somebody said, marketing begins, and we don't have a lot of visibility into those things, right? And so, which is now why I think a lot of CIOs are reporting to CMOs, as it turns out, in the middle market. That's a new phenomenon. I think George mentioned that. So those are some of the ways that IT can help.
I think marketing gets a bad name because it it does collect a lot of personal information for a very specific purpose, by the way.
Yeah.
The challenge is the rest of the organization that stores their files and emails a spreadsheet, and then 5 people email the same spreadsheet over and again, and it is general sprawl because it exists, and there are good governance practices. You can say, sorry, we're not going to let anybody keep any emails more than a year. That's a choice. Otherwise, you have to do automated scanning to understand what you have, and you can always know, and you can know what you had there before a breach, because if you're scanning it and you're keeping a continuous, at least indication of metadata, then you can understand what you already have.
Yeah, well, this goes back, Irina, to your question as well, because very to your point, absolutely. If you have enough money, you can scan everything and you can know where it all is, and how buttoned down it is, and you've got the resources. Bank of America spends $1 billion a year, I'm told, something like that, just on cybersecurity. Our government spends infinitely more, I'm sure. But you're a sole practitioner. Your business is email and it's in the cloud, and you might be Dropbox, and you may have Zoom meeting recordings over on the Zoom website, and God knows what else, where else, and everything. What's a small one person? They can't afford that. And so now we begin to get into okay, so what still must you do? And Bob, I think you laid it out quite well at a high level of that. But just as one example, and Scott, you do forensics, so you know this well. When you walk into a situation, you're called in on a breach, and the forensics people tell you that they don't have logs. It's like, well, you get quite limited in your ability to track down who did what to whom. And flip the question back to Irina, you're on a single Windows workstation or a Mac workstation, and you're connected to the cloud and so on. What kind of logging even is reasonable? I throw that out to all of you. Yeah.
I would start with that general concept that everybody can do data minimization. It's not a technical problem. It's a personal choice. Are you going to allocate time, even as a sole practitioner, to minimize how much data you collect? That's a place to start for everybody, and it's not a technical cost question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Irina, you threw another point in about your major point of vulnerability seeming to be the email. That's the first point of entry often, although Scott, you talked about the network now superseding the email weaknesses in the network. You want to raise that? I mean, let's explore the hypothesis.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to answer your question, if your main point of vulnerability is your email, then that should be the main focus of whatever security safeguards you put in place, whether that's MFA, whether that's additional logging, that's data minimization. That's where you want to focus it on. But where we have seen historically in the trends that have changed, like I mentioned, over the past year, 56% of the matters that we're dealing on are network intrusions, and then the another 24% is all a business email compromise. Business email compromise now is number 2. For the last 5 years, business email compromise was the number 1 attack vector. And what I mentioned previously was that the way in which that over time has changed that method has been the security safeguards available for that. You now have MFA, which is built in standard on so many cloud service providers. In fact, Gmail accounts now offer it. It's now by default. Now it's just a matter of kind of reminding people who have those emails to turn it on. Okay, and that's going to prevent like 90% of the data breaches. The other involving your email account. The other 10% involve training those people, recognizing all the ways in which they can bypass MFA and limit the intrusion into that email account.
Yeah, well, one of you earlier talked about what we're seeing a lot of now in the MFA bypass, and we've reported on this on our cybersecurity news of the week regularly, is that you get a notification on your smartphone that says, do you accept this connection? And then you don't know about this connection, so you click no. And then 10 seconds later, you get another request and you click no, and you clicking no until you get tired of clicking no and you just say yes. And now you get the bad guys in, and we're seeing more. I think, Jason, you were talking, was it you, that's not that you've let them in, so that means the insurance may not cover you? Is that right?
No, I never said that.
Oh, you didn't.
It's another Jason.
Mhm.
That wasn't me. I didn't
Okay.
say that.
Somebody talked about that.
I mean,
as having an
resistance
impact.
is futile, right? That's the old
Yeah.
Borg thing. I mean, that's what you're saying. That wasn't me. No,
Okay.
I mean, as far as the insurance coverages, they're changing. You've got to look at the endorsements. You got to look at the carbacks, and every single carrier is different. I think Rob said in a chat earlier in the first session about Lloyd's in London and what they were excluding. You've got to look at what the needs are of your client, and you have to go ahead and tailor a policy accordingly. You can always buy back that coverage with an endorsement to cover third party and first party on that aspect of it. So, and there's a lot of Lloyd syndicates out there. I mean, we all heard the Beasleys and CFCs of the world, that type of thing, but there's also Lloyd's of like Tokyo Marine is HCC, Houston Casualty. That's our policy right there. You've got Cowbell, you got Wingman. I mean, they come out from everywhere. So again, you have to look at what endorsements they're covering you and what the exposure is. And again, it comes down to the tolerant of risk of each company and each individual that's doing it, or not doing it, but running the company. Everybody tolerates risk a lot different. So that's
it's a yes, and we all talk, and that's a piece of the worksheet. If you download the PDF, is to help you sort out, because what might be a catastrophic loss to me may is chump change to Jeff Bezos. It's in terms of net worth.
Everything is relative. I mean, I go back to the LA Unified School District.
Yeah.
Okay. And you look at that LA Unified School District breach. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. And if they're not, and Rob's back on the East Coast, but mostly on the West Coast, that's the second largest schools district in the country. They got a ransomware, and they gave the bad guys the finger, and now it's all over the news. And then it became an extortion.
Yeah.
So again, things evolve, and I have worked with school districts. I'm not going to name them. They don't care, and they don't have reasonable security. And my daughter was a victim of it. That a long time ago. She was a victim of cyberbullying and a cyber attack. So again, and she was a student of a different Southern California school district. But again, these school districts are way behind the curveball.
Yeah.
Way behind.
So again, going back to the question of reasonableness, and yesterday there was a talk at this conference I was at, the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance, by the CIO of LAUSD and the FBI agent that was responsible for working with them. It's not been publicly acknowledged, been in the news, but given how much data, they have 16 petabytes of data, I believe the school district told me, which is like, gigabytes, and then there's petabytes, right?
If they're telling you that,
terabytes and petabytes, it's like,
double it.
oh my God.
Yeah.
There were 550 gigs was all that was taken. So it was like a less than 0.00, like 1% or something like that. But still, all the bad news and the publicity, which becomes a whole other side of cyber breaches and all. Scott, you earlier were going to talk some about the costs of breaches, because that factors into how much is it worth us to keep from that breach occurring, what's the cost. Give us some data that you've seen, and we'll ask others to kind of jump in on that as well.
Certainly. So when we're talking about the costs of a data breach, you have to look at it in a couple of different ones. Number one, there's going to be whatever legal costs that you have, and that's going to be directly based off of how expensive your lawyer is. So the second one is your forensic investigation costs. On average, it's around $60,000 for most forensic investigation costs. Smaller ones, you may have a laptop that needs to be reviewed. It may be, you know, 15K. You know, if you've got a huge network, it may be $500,000, but on average, we're saying it's around $60,000 for forensic investigation costs. If you're hit with ransomware, then you're talking about the time and effort to rebuild your network essentially from scratch. And those remediation costs, again, vary by the size of the organization, but even a small company with like 50 to 60 employees, they may have remediation costs of upwards of 100,000 just to get themselves back up and running. Not to mention if they're having to pay a ransom. Our average ransom demand that we have seen across the board is around $800,000, which is very, very high. It's the highest it's been in quite a while. It's not the highest. The largest ransom demand that our clients have seen over the past year was about $65 million. The largest paid was around $40 million. So there's definitely some whales out there. The threat actors do change their ransom demand based off of the income of the organization and the size of the organization. So they at least will give you that break. But those are significant costs. So when you're looking at between legal, and then let's say you have to do notification costs. Most states require you to send written letters, and you're talking about $1 and change just for the postage and the envelope and the letter itself, not to mention having to offer credit monitoring, which may be another $10 to $20 depending on how many people enroll and how many people you're having to notify in what states. So the notification costs alone is directly relating to the number of affected individuals that are impacted. The forensic investigation cost is directly related to the size of your organization. So if you have a small organization, but you have a ton of data, I've got a lot of small financial advisors that I work with, and sometimes it gets to the point where I had one, he says, I got about 90 clients of mine. And we just said, it's not even worth doing a forensic investigation. We're just going to notify all 90 people. In that situation, that may be applicable, but in many cases, it's not. So that's just a kind of a rough what we're seeing in terms of costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alex, what are you seeing in terms of, when a new client, let's say, calls, they've been a victim of a ransomware attack, and now you do have to go basically start over with their network. What's that look like from your side, including the costs of that? I mean, acknowledging it's good revenue for you. It's also, an expensive burden on your new client.
Yeah, and it's revenue, and it can be, it's in the tens of thousands of dollars usually, right? I mean, one laptop is $1,200 right now. Like if we're talking a PC laptop, or Mac is even more. So however many user devices they need to replace, firewall appliance, network appliances. Not hopefully they will then get a firewall having had an incident, or maybe they already had one, but a lot of that stuff needs to be replaced. You just don't know. Oftentimes they have old appliances that have vulnerabilities. It's not worth patching. They didn't really fit the bill to begin with. Each one of those units is several $1,000s. There's the labor, but this is not the kind of work we frankly want to do, right? I mean, to come in after an incident, just culturally, it's a very difficult environment to work in, right? I mean, of course, either approvals are easy to get, but it's just not the kind of, we'd rather work on the proactive side of things. But it's after everything Scott just outlined, right? The legal costs, crisis PR, forensics, regulatory damages, fines, all of that stuff. You then have the IT replacement costs, which are, it's the same thing. It's tens of or hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? However you slice it. So, and then it's also the disruption to the operating environment, right? I mean, they've just had downtime. We now have to take things offline a little bit more in order to kind of slot in our infrastructure, right? The new infrastructure and some user acceptance testing and all that. It's all this. It's also disruptive. I mean, it's just a all around bad situation. So yeah, I would advocate proactive, and have insurance, because frankly, I've met customers who want to self-insure because they can't reasonably get to a place of reasonableness and get cyber coverage in time because they need high limits and because the business they're in. So some of them have chosen to self-insure and put away funds for a rainy day. But if you can get cyber insurance, I would advocate for clients doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Good-
I'd
good
throw,
point.
I'd throw in just a couple. I don't disagree with what's been said, but I do want to make a couple comments on this that relate to the cost. First of all, they have to have a little bit of discretion on who's doing the investigation. Who the forensics. There are a lot of people who do it, but and a lot depends on the type of entity. Companies are good at it, and then they get bad at it. We find that we're constantly updating people, and there may be other reasons. For instance, we had a company that had a breach that was a credit card vendor, in that ecosphere. And the important thing was to have someone who really understood the credit card industry and PCI DSS, even though that wasn't the issue. But it was what made the customers confident. So, there's a bit of that there. I'd also say that in terms of ransomware payments, I highly recommend against. I know that it's hard not to, but I recommend against it for a couple of reasons. One of them, it's very often illegal. And if you want to do it, you're going to have to get a license from the Commerce Department, because you're typically sending money to someone who either by virtue of who they are or where they are is on the suspicious persons list.
OFAC.
And that's on the OFAC list. Yeah,
OFAC.
thanks. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. Secondly, there was an excellent study at the end of last year that covered hundreds of breaches and ransomware, and they determined that in almost every case, you had a better result if you did not pay the ransom and you simply used a backup system. Very often, the people who hold the data are not the people who hold the key, aren't the people who locked it up to begin with. There's no customer support in these areas. It's very hard. Typically, it's very, very hard to rebuild a system from using an encryption key. You're always going to lose some data. But if you have a good backup system, and you've tested that system, then you have a better chance of doing it. And finally, to Scott's point, Scott made a good point that some people say, "Hey, look, we got breached. We got X number of people. We're just going to announce it." I also think that that's not necessarily a good practice, because if you don't do the forensic investigation, you really won't know what. You may not find out anyway, because people may have thrown away their logs or done all the things we tell people not to do when there's a breach. But if you don't know what happened, you're not going to be able to create a decent narrative, and you won't be able to do as good a job rebuilding your system and understanding your vulnerabilities. So all those things make it more expensive, but I would just throw those out as commentary on what were all good statements.
Yeah. Hey, if I could jump in on that, my experience has been a little bit different. Number one, we rarely get into a situation where you have a sanctioned entity that's dealing with it, because quite honestly, if they become sanctioned on the OFAC list, they either rename themselves or do something else. So we are rarely in that situation where we're prohibited from making a payment. It does happen, but occasionally it does. And the second of all is when we do make a payment, it's because the backups were impacted. It's if you had a backup to go to, we won't be making a payment in the first place. So that's rarely a situation that we encounter. But otherwise, yeah, I absolutely agree to you. But my recommendation in terms of, if you need to know, what happened, and you need to do a forensic investigation. But oftentimes, when I'm dealing with a solo financial advisor, we know exactly what happened. He got a phishing email, he responded to it, and they got access to Office 365. There's no mystery in that. We don't need a forensic investigation, and it's not going to be cost effective for a solo to spend upwards of $14,000 to do that investigation if at the end of the day they've got 90 clients who are just going to notify. So but it's very much fact specific, and there are very much cases where it is important to know exactly how this happened so that you could take steps to prevent it from happening in the future.
Yeah. I would think there is very situational, in part just on the industry. If you're a defense contractor, you've got a different set of obligations than if you're a sole proprietor accountant. I think they're so understanding those legal implications of all. It's top of the hour, 1 o'clock. Let's take a real quick break, 3 minutes this time, and then we'll come back. We're going to get David Lamb on here. We got to figure out how to do it. If I could ask the panelists to keep the videos going, even if you get up for a moment. I'm going to share my screen, and I say that because I'm having we may have some trouble getting 7 of us all on at the same time. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Yeah. So yeah, let's spend this next hour around the technology infrastructure and what's being said about reasonableness. The NIST cybersecurity framework being one document, the Center for Internet Security, their stuff, SOC reports and ISO and so on, with the idea that when we don't look ahead 10 years and we've now reduced reasonable security to practice, it's going to be built up out of those kinds of documents. But what does that look like, and where is it headed, and how do we distinguish reasonableness for an AT&T, Verizon, Zoom, Facebook, etc., with reasonableness for the small and mid-sized market that so many of us work in, and even down deeper? Irina, you become the poster child here. I mean, what's the sole practitioner, the real small business, expected to do, whether it's 1 person, 2 person, 3 people, as contrasted to these small and mid-sized businesses? So let's start with what we're seeing, and this becomes the legal question, how we're seeing reasonableness play out in the market. Certain states, Ohio, Connecticut, I believe, Utah, have all passed laws using the word reasonableness as get out of jail free cards if you're sued. And they try to put some meat on what that means. And Scott, you want to jump in and start that discussion, what that begins to look like?
So well, I mean, I'm going to tell you, practically speaking, because I have yet to see anything that creates a safe harbor that says you do these things and you're immune from liability. What I think essentially what those are going to happen is it's going to come down to the plaintiff's bar or the class action litigants are going to say you experienced a breach and therefore it was unreasonable, and they're going to start off by saying whatever you've done, no matter how much security you have, the fact is that you had a breach, therefore by necessity it wasn't reasonable enough, because if it was reasonable you wouldn't have had a breach. And then what you then have now is, okay, now you have the other defense side saying, okay, well, it is reasonable. Look at all we complied with NIST, we complied with the Center for Internet Security controls. We're doing what our peers are doing, therefore it's inherently reasonable. And then it gets down to what it's decided in the court. That's the inherent problem that we have with such a subjective standard as reasonableness.
Yeah. Bob, do you jump in as well? Take your perspective.
No, why should I just repeat what Scott said? Yeah, no, I think that basically, I think that's right. I don't think I think that there are, as I said earlier, as Scott just said, there are standards for which you can point to, but the position that a plaintiff's bar will take is there is a breach, therefore you didn't have reasonable security. Simple enough. I think that I think then the question is, well, what can you do to prove reasonable security? And I think that goes back to the idea that you have to spend some time understanding your risk profile, understanding what going over your show that you have analyzed your security maturity and you've taken steps to address it. And that one would hope that by taking reasonable steps, and the assessment is just as important as the steps you take, because simply following this or whatever system, CIS, whatever it may be, won't work unless you've shown that you thought about it enough to say, well, this is the best solution for us, or these are the types of solutions we can. I also think that it's not going to be a matter of how much money you throw at it. you can, as we used to say with our IT budget, we gave them an unlimited budget and they exceeded it. The issue is really going to be, did you analyze, did you evaluate, and did you take action based on your evaluation? Did you get the right outside help to do so? Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Part of the challenge though as well is the what really works when you're in a deposition, you're in the courtroom, like a thick file of proof, the old-fashioned thick file of proof. Whether that's a cliche or not in the legal world, but the reality is that we've seen some breaches that have occurred where there has been California Attorney General action. And if you can illustrate and demonstrate that you did everything that you said you were going to do, both not just technical, this isn't about, printing out a bunch of log files as Alex might, or I might do as a technical person traditionally, right? Oh, look at all these, things we did. It's more about was leadership involved? Was there negligence in terms of the leadership? And what we've learned is that if you can demonstrate that you were leading it reasonably, we've seen cases dropped by the Attorney General, for some of our accounts. Think SolarWinds and Kaseya issues for Alex in the technical world, where like, it happened and we lost personal information. But governance and regulatory compliance demonstration seems to be one of the answers, but there is nothing that is literally black and white on paper that can save you, right?
Yeah,
right.
There's no way. There's no black and white. You're absolutely right. But I think that your point about governance is important. I think one of the things that maybe Scott and I are looking at is that I think we have a better chance of addressing a potential regulatory action. When I look at it, if I look at one of my hobbies, silly me, I look at privacy policies. So I look at privacy policies. So that's not conforming. They have a chance. AG is going to go after them. That's not conforming. That's an issue that's badly written, or whatever it is. But the AG is a different type of adversary from a plaintiff's counsel, because frankly, not to cast any disparagement, but I'm going to, is that they're here to shake you down. They're not, they're interested in getting money from you. They file a lawsuit. They have enough to go forward. They're going to get their fees. It's not, the AG. It's, you settle with the AG, and and a lot of times you can convince them that there was, or sometimes you can convince them there wasn't an issue. And they're also much more rational about the regulators are much more rational about who they go after. So it's a different world there.
Yeah.
Can I ask a related question, two sides of a related question? The first is, Bob and Scott, what do you think about the Sedona Conference recommendation with respect to the definition of reasonable security? The second half of the question is, every time I talk about this with attorneys that focus in this area, one of the answers I keep getting is that proving harm is very, very difficult for plaintiffs. And that obviously impacts the impact of a data breach also. So there's two questions that's out of that there.
I'm going to jump in with the second one for a second, because I don't pay as much attention to the Sedona Conference as some people do. I think it's a good group of people, but I don't go. I think there are two things that have happened. For a long, long time, harm has been what has stood in the way of a successful lawsuit. There are now two things that have changed. One of them is, in California, you have the potential for statutory damages. You don't have to prove that there were actual damages. The second is that there was, I believe it was a Third Circuit case. It was reported several weeks ago, where a judge allowed a case to go forward without proving there was actual damage. It didn't. The case hasn't been decided, but it didn't get stopped in summary judgment. They showed that because there was an expectation, that because there had been a breach and there was an expectation there could be harm, they allowed the case to go forward. So what I'm seeing is a movement toward a movement in the courts toward, toward lessening that issue, lessening the issue of harm. So now for class actions, it may still continue to be an issue that you can't, the class actions are difficult because, there are other technical reasons. I'm not a class action lawyer. I just read about it on TV, or see it on TV, but I think that there is a movement there. I'd be interested in what Scott has to say, because Scott and I don't always agree, so I'd be interested in where he stands on that.
Yeah. So the idea of harm, I mean, you've got this CCPA, which is basically a statutory private right of action, so you don't even need to prove harm, but harm remains to be a consistent problem across all class action litigations, and in fact all data breaches, because of the volume of data breaches that have happened. Is the fraud related to your breach, or was it related to the Equifax breach or the Anthem breach or some other breach that happened years, months, or days before or days after? I mean, the issue is not necessarily the harm, it's the causation. How do you prove that it was in fact our breach that caused your damages as opposed to somebody else? I tend to view that the harm is, you can usually articulate the harm. Well, I suffered X amount of identity theft damages, and I lost this, and this. Now, thankfully, though, on the harm side, well, causation is one problem. The harm side itself, so much of the existing consumer protection laws have been in place to minimize the harm to the consumer. You have a consumer that has identity theft, they report it to their bank or their credit card, and it's reversed. They inevitably don't have much harm other than the process of dealing with it and dealing with identity theft. And in my view, that's less of a concern or less of a risk. So, I guess to answer your first question regarding the Sedona commentary, I have not spent a lot of time researching that either. I think it just came out. Well, it was out in 2020. Was the last one that I heard, and even then the guidance was kind of withdrawn as they're considering it more and more. But if I remember correctly, it looked at kind of the cost benefit analysis and the cost benefit approach to the security safeguards in place. That becomes problematic. Well, I don't know problematic, but it becomes a little bit difficult because, how are you defining the harm? Because it goes back to the individual consumer has minimal harm, and in most cases. So how do you really articulate the value and the cost benefit analysis of the expense associated with the security breach versus the legitimate actual harm to the individual?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point, because oftentimes we can't know the harm to the third parties that have been damaged, that may have been damaged, let's say, but we also know the cost to the company of not doing those things. I mean, you talked earlier about a $40 million ransomware payment and so on. So there's still the cost benefit analysis of, just to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
How much money do we spend?
But if we're debating that for a little bit, because inevitably that's a cost to the company.
Yes.
So I mean, like I don't think there should be a regulatory framework or legal framework based on reasonableness that inevitably is going to cause more harm to the company when they're already being impacted by this. I think that cost should be focused on what's the actual harm that the individual consumer has, and then judge the cost benefit analysis based off of that.
Yeah,
David,
just a segue off. I'm going to bring in our another panelist, David Lamb. First, David, just say a few words. You're my, we work together at Miller Kaplan, obviously, but also, just reflect your thoughts on what Scott's just said, and welcome to the panel. Yeah.
Well, thank you. As everyone here knows, I like to consider myself Stan's arch nemesis. So it troubles me deeply to really support what my reading is of the Sedona conference and talking about it from like the implementation perspective. So our practice at Miller Kaplan is focused on helping small and medium businesses, achieve commercially reasonable practice. And so in the Sedona conference write-up on their test, it talks about a couple of things that I think are really important. I think the first thing it references is, California says the bar should be the Center for Internet Security Standards. So number one, we're getting some sense of where that bar is, right? Two, the write-up talks about all of the regimes that they're looking for measurement use this form of risk analysis. And I know Bob focused on, and I have no problem agreeing with Bob. Bob focused on, this risk analysis. Well, the first element here, and I know Barry and I have had extensive conversations about this. The first element is, are you looking at the risk and are you making decisions around the risk as presented to you with everything going on? And so, we talked about specific things is, what's the industry doing? And the Sedona conference references this, and I'm obviously looking at the text. And certain regulatory agencies, like we're doing a lot of DOL, Department of Labor work right now, they've given you what they expect. The insurance companies are super clear. You don't have MFA coming inbound to your network. You don't have MFA on your cloud solutions. We're not going to write your policies. All of this comes together at a very base level, the practice of information security and looking at your risk reward, right? I guess the old law joke is, what do you call, a person who represents themselves in court a fool? And right here, it's the same thing. If you're running your email without multi-factor authentication, you're a fool, because you're not, we can laugh about that, but I have clients who still fight on this. Oh, we can't do it. I mean, the users are going to die, or there's a technical constraint. So it's that risk analysis that comes in first with a view to what's reasonable. And here's the thing that kills me. The thing that really kills me about this the most is that so many of these practices cost almost nothing to do now. Patching, right? Following the Microsoft compliance scorecard, right? Doing a Center for Internet Security, implementation group 1 assessment. These are just simple things that businesses can do just to get on the road, just to show that they're managing it, that they're considering the risk, they're understanding. And with a competent IT provider, with appropriate, legal support, folks are able to navigate through this in a sane way. And my exasperation is, how do we get people to understand that you just got to get in the process? You gotta, take a little bit to boil at a time. And then you start getting to where is reasonable, right? Then you start getting to, Center for Internet Security Implementation Group 1 is not an impossible bar. You can at least be moving along the road to get there at very, very reasonable costs.
Yeah, well, I think, and Barry, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this as well, but I think your point is well taken. Start the journey, be on the journey. That's maybe your best defense. Barry, jump in.
I think I agree, but I think that's exactly what Bob said as well. If you show that you are taking action, that is the beginning of defense. And as you said at the very beginning, boiling the ocean isn't a great thing to do. I think anybody who's been involved in this space for even limited amount of time will recognize that it keeps changing. What you need to do today is different than what you'll need to do tomorrow and the day after. You will never finish. So there's no reason to assume you're going to finish. You just need to start on the path.
Interesting and I agree. I mean, completely with you. It's being on that path. Alex, jump in on what's that look like from your side, and then George, and then I want to go to a different piece of the path. how we get the path going. But let's stay here for just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think David hit on some really good points. So there is a risk equation, right, that gets used. There's a couple of folks in the industry that really like to lead with that. But in simple terms, and I'll paste it in here, I have it somewhere with a really good explanation of what the different variables stand for. But at a basic level, I mean, where I have success is when I'm talking to a business stakeholder and I go, look, this is the industry you're in, this is the type of law firm, creative agency, nonprofit, et cetera, tech startup. Here's some peers that have had incidents. This data is fairly easy to come by, right? Look at what, let's look at what their costs were. Let's reasonably try to back into what this cost these people and try to put yourself in their shoes. Now, here's what I'm saying to you, Mr. Customer. I'm saying, let's look at the CIS 18 and the subset of those that are applicable to you. You don't have physical servers, so you're not going to be patching physical servers, but the rest of a lot of the stuff, maybe 12, 13, 14 out of the 18 will probably apply in some way, shape, or form, right? A lot of them, like David said, are behavioral. MFA, there's no charge to flip on MFA in M365 or Google Workspace. There's not a cost associated to that. There's a behavioral and change management cost, and a lot of them are like that, these controls. And so let's, if we're talking, Mr. Customer, a highly probable event that's going to cost you in the mid six figures or maybe higher. And this program we're laying out to you, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Let's take some of those CIS controls and put them in each of those phases. And here's a basic kind of a program you can follow. $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for the year to stave off mid six figures of highly probable risk. I mean, is that good math, ROI? I think so. I mean, when I have those kinds of conversations, I tend to get somewhere. I think the problem people fall into is they think that they're, or lay people, business stakeholders, I mean, people not in IT and security, I think they fall into a situation because they're very smart. They think they're going to figure this stuff out on their own. And I think it's like me trying to figure out, legal or my own medical care. It just is not, it's a non-starter. You've got to get some outside help, right? Let the professionals do their part and you run your business. So, yeah.
And
Yeah, well said. George, yeah, jump in on this. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Wow. Specifically as it comes to, and I'm going to feed off of what Alex said, vulnerability and patching, and, there is what makes sense and what's reasonable. And then there's my opinion. Let's get my opinion out of the way. If you bought a car that you needed to take into the service shop every Tuesday because it was manufactured improperly, and you still bought that car, that's pretty frustrating, right? You would never buy a car like that. Yet the software that's being developed that we install is the biggest part of the problem. There wouldn't necessarily be a requirement to patch every Tuesday had the software been coded correctly in the first place. My opinion. So what do we do about it? Why we have patch Tuesdays, right? Now we have continuous patching. Now we have what essentially are controls and things that we suggest. And what's interesting is that if you look at how compliance and governance are handled internationally, especially in data privacy laws, you see a lot of prescriptive recommendations, right? But in the US, things are less prescriptive. So when we start talking about controls that you have to do versus controls that make things reasonable, it can kind of muddy the waters because there's so many different industries and regulations when it comes to the matter of what controls you're using or what frameworks you're using. Excuse me. In the layman's term, I think that you're going to see a lot more utility-based models and accountability for the utility models that exist out there, and less IT function within, in-house infrastructure. I think that's not unusual. We already know that, things are going to the cloud, as we say generically. So how how you're handling controls and the patching issue, and kind of that cyber risk management function is as this kind of that combination of what does your recipe look like, what does your plan look like, and as long as you're pursuing that reasonably, then if the software maker makes a mistake, and I think we can all look at SolarWinds and Kaseya as an example of that, how are you still held accountable? And I think the answer is that, we're not sure, right? I think that's where the litigation might come into play. But for the common person, right, a more personal note, nothing is more frustrating than coming back from vacation, which I did last month. While I was on vacation, my mom called me. My bank account's been emptied. Person in charge of or runs a cyber risk and cybersecurity company's own mother had her bank account emptied. That was a bad day. And then I got a call from her sister the following week, my aunt, and her bank account had been emptied 2 weeks in a row within 7 days. So I think the point of that is that people, consumers, especially seniors, that's our why. That's why we have to understand what the community does. And IT alone it's just not the answer anymore. You can't just look at the IT guy anymore. And so the controls start to become soft controls, like, is marketing meeting every weekend? Or every week rather, to talk about, the sensitive data they collect and those behaviors. And those guidelines and standards really aren't there. There's no requirement for that. But ultimately, it's a losing battle for anybody in tech to stay on top of something they didn't build. Because I'm sorry, we didn't make the cookies. We didn't bake them. We just sold them, right? And we're supposed to be the professional that can handle them. We're happy to do that, but if it was done defectively, and you have to bring your computer in every week for a repair, right? I mean, at some point, that's going to become continuous, where things have to be patched on the fly, even if it's legacy. So you're going to see controls that are more soft in nature, of no technology debt beyond 5 years, but there's no requirement to do so yet. So that balance, we're nowhere near that. So hopefully that answered the question appropriately, but
it's a good reflection on the situation we're in. And it caused me, I just went to another PowerPoint deck to bring up a slide that it basically what you talked about suggested, but it's also what we've been talking about so much of the discussion. And yeah, Alex, good analysis of risk, impact times probability, and so on. But go back to the discussion, the point, not the discussion so much, Bob, that you made. Again, I mean, at some sense, you and Scott were positioned as the point of the spear, because you got the legal side on the legal force behind you, and yet there's no obligation your clients have to listen to anything you say to them, nor to listen to you, Barry, or to me. And I mean, some of our clients listen to David, I'm sorry to have to say, but some do. And the same with Alex and George. And the national crisis that we're in around this as well, and the crisis at the individual, brought to mind the following. And as I said, I'm going to share my screen again just to show this slide. This is Peter Drucker, and I use this screen regularly in my discussions when I'm talking to business owners, business executives, and others, that we're living in a time where there is no leadership. We're still struggling to find it in cybersecurity. I mean, true leadership would be, okay, here's the path, we're on it, let's go down it, let's everybody do what we got to do. If you're the defensive tackle, you got a set of responsibilities and plays you got to know. If you're the cheerleader, you got plays you got to know, and what to do. And if you're in the band or the tight end, I'm using obviously sports metaphors, but it's all requires leadership. And if you look at the situation we're in, and you look at, in some ways, where the discussion in many ways is led, I mean, there's obviously friction between IT on the one hand, let's get the systems, we got to keep things running, and the cybersecurity implications of that. We've got friction legally. How do we You know, how do we identify how much harm there's been? And, you know, when we push the legal side against the technical side, you know, well, how do we get all this done? And then you got different sizes of companies, Irina, one person, mid-sized companies and so on. Tons of confusion. Do we follow the Center for Internet Security? Do we follow NIST? What does it mean to even follow NIST? You know, I mean, there's no certification that one can go to and be certified compliant. And Dave, as David will point out, when we do SOC 2 reviews of clients who've been through assessments and have a certificate, we regularly find that, you know, the SOC 2 has been limited in what it specifically applies to. That may or may not apply to the situation we find ourselves in. Again, confusion. And I think the underperformance lives at the cost of all the breaches, the cybercrime. God, I mean, George, your mother and your aunt, you know, and we have one of our people, mother lost, you know, she was a scam on gift cards, all of that. We as a nation are underperforming, I can definitely say. So I offer this, and I suggest let's talk about leader. How do we as a community, I mean, we're Secure the Village. We're about how do we help the community help itself better? Okay, so how do we help these business executives, business owners and all better understand their need for leadership in all of this? Is it simply wait until they're breached and hope that now they know not to put their hand on the hot stove, you know? Or are there things we can do in advance to help them, and recognizing it's never going to be all or nothing, you know, we're going to move incrementally as more businesses and more people do what they need to do. How do we do that?
I know that could be assumed a rhetorical question, but you know, the generic thing that comes to the top of my mind that I think any common individual, technical or otherwise, would at least to some degree understand is we need wellness in the community. So, and that is the idea of, you know, it's like a free clinic concept, right? How do I make sure I'm staying healthy, eating right? That way I don't end up in the doctor's office, sort of a concept. But you know, what does that look like? And you know, money doesn't grow on trees, right? So these things take you know, community efforts, possibly grant funding, federal dollars that are cascading down today in the form of workforce development initiatives. You know, so I think there's a lot of irons in the fire right now, but not a uniform. You know, there isn't a regional model that can be scaled and made uniform throughout other cities. Maybe what we see today is a lack of maturity across the board, and the natural evolution here of, I think maybe that's why I like the car industry, right? I mean, heck, you don't need to take your car in for service for every 12,000 miles these days, right? But when the car industry started, which was a long time ago, I mean, your car's broken down on the side of the road, you have to go to the mechanic and tune this and tune that for a while. And that was our today's software. We're still calling software that's 30-year-old code.
Yeah.
You know, it's like putting the Model T engine into a 1940s vehicle, right? You're just not going to do that, right? So, so I think this is probably one of the, you know, one of the university areas, as we would say, is, you know, universities perhaps need to do a better job in terms of, you know, the people that are coding, and so that's part of the equation as well. But what can we do? The car's already on the road, right? We're already there, and we're trying to, you know, as a community, trying to do a better job to keep sensitive data sacred. So, and the most glaring area that all of us data crunchers are focused on are where most of the breaches happen, right? Email, you know, it's common sense to focus on those things, but the reality is that we're not doing the best of jobs as an aggregate community, including Microsoft and how they build the products. So I think it's going to be a long haul. I think there's going to be a lot of challenges that we face, but at least in the trenches within the community, the biggest is the resource of making sure people have wellness and awareness. So
I like that metaphor. Alex, you're nodding your head. Yeah, yeah.
I think that one of the things that we need to do is change the language. The security industry in general has always had one of the discussion topics on the forefront, which is risk. And business understands risk. The question is how to balance it, all the risks they have to deal with, and against all the alternatives they have for spending money. But the newer and some of the rest of the world, the rest of the business world, is changing the way the behavior exists with respect to how business leaders are motivated. I mean, you've got customers telling you have to have a security program. We're going to audit your security program, and we're going to audit your privacy controls. So there's some natural motivation there. The one topic that we're not talking about enough that will resonate with business leaders is trust, and ensuring that they understand that their business is going to thrive or not thrive in the future on the trust of their consumers. And focusing on that as a topic helps to define some metrics that will help also drive, what do I have to do to make sure that I'm optimizing trust? One of the things I'm finding fascinating these days is that it is new startups that are focused on this already. They know they don't have the money for it, but they're focused on it. And that's a good beginning.
That's a good beginning, because we often hear the other side of it. I'm looking for that minimum viable product. I got to get it out on the market because I got to start making revenues, and we don't have time for security. We'll do that next product or the one after that. So the fact that they're already thinking trust, is this perhaps a sea change? Are others of you seeing that as well? Is this perhaps a sea change?
Yeah, on the development side, I think one example is, it's just a small example, but there is there's a Google offering for the Google Play Store Droid, right? So if you have an app that a developer can subscribe to, it's called Checks, and what it does is it, as the programmer is coding, right? If the AI detects that what that programmer is coding might be calling sensitive data, it stops the programmer and flags it as something that needs to be addressed as collection of sensitive data. Before you even release the product to the Google Store, so when you have your app and you put it on the Google Store, right? If you haven't done that, if you haven't gone through that exercise with this Checks implementation, then you don't get published on the store, right? And so the point is looking to the apps, and the Apple Store is similar, right? So they have a big privacy initiative at Apple. And so it's these larger, let's face it, larger organizations that own digital real estate. It's digital real estate, folks, right? So Amazon, Apple, Google, this is where your data is living, right? Your personal information is living. Facebook, TikTok, right? And so the question then becomes, what else out there is going to make that situation better in both cloud as well as on premise? And I think that was Barry's point, was, hey man, we're getting emails. It's, whether it's an 0365 or not, right? People open Outlook and download it onto the computer. Yeah, that's how we do things traditionally, right? We send emails and attachments, and 0365 or not, that data is now in 7 different places. So that is the key problem, I believe, is that we don't know where data collection and processing are happening all of the time as small businesses. I mean, I don't know what that means, is what I've heard. And what you say, as Alex said, is also really important. I mentioned how my mom had her bank account emptied, and I remember telling her, and by the way, I'm learning Croatian. It's part of the story. And I told her, well, you need to use MFA. And she goes, oh, is that a new Croatian word? No. It stands, and then I realized, I just told her a 3-letter acronym because that's what I know, right? You have to change the language. You have to change and make things relatable. Yeah. You can't talk flux capacitors and MFAs to the average person, right? So that's another part of the problem, is the vernacular that we're using as well.
Yeah, that's a big problem. As I said earlier, CISA is all about how do we change the language. The White House is talking about that. White House also coming out with security development requirements for companies to sell software to the government. So we'll get better software engineering, one hopes over time to make it easier. I mean, David, you've used the metaphor for a long time. The faster your car goes, you got a Lamborghini, you better have good brakes, and security and privacy are the brakes. Yeah.
I'd like to, Stan, if I can for just a second, touch on something Alex said earlier.
Sure.
And that is, Alex talked about, all these folks are trying to solve the problem by themselves.
You just froze.
I think we lost him.
I think we just lost him. Hopefully he'll come back in just a moment, finish the thought. But as we do that, let's see, Scott or Bob, jump in on kind of.
I think David's back.
Yeah, I think I came back.
Oh, there you are. You did come back.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, Scott. Sorry, Bob. We'll get you next.
The important point here is it's simple to start the framework. The frameworks aren't hard. And so if just get started, right? We'll take the page out of Barry's book. Get started in a framework, point yourself in a direction, start checking off what you can do. And so much of that is not hard. It's brushing your teeth. You just got to do it.
So let's hypothesize. Let's say a $30 million company. I've gotten started. I've appointed somebody to be a security manager. That person's built taken a framework, let's say the NIST cybersecurity framework. They have, through those, developed policies that say, here's what we're going to do. They do an assessment, and oh my God, there's all this stuff remaining to be done. Where they, look at it. Okay, we got 130 things on this list. Barry, we can't boil the ocean. We decide, okay, these are the 3 things we're going to work on over the next quarter. And they do that, and they get 2 of them done. And then they finish that quarter and say, okay, we're going to finish that one that we didn't finish, and here's 2 more we're going to do. And in the middle of that, they get breached. Scott, Bob, you want to defend a class action suit in this case with this client?
So I mean, I have no problem defending them. Absolutely. It happens all the time because security is not a state, it's a process. So inevitably, nearly all of my clients are going to have stuff that they didn't get to, or they're going to have stuff that they couldn't afford to get to. What's more important is that number one, that they dedicated the resources, 2, that they have a process in place and they've documented that process. Okay, if I have documentation that says, look, we did an analysis that we were striving towards NIST, we have X number of things, but we have a game plan for reaching those things. Okay, that is something I'm very comfortable defending. I have no problem with that. The struggle is going to be where 9 times out of 100, it's something stupid that they did and should have known better. Like, they didn't have MFA in place. Like they had a laptop that didn't have encryption on it. Those are the ones that are much more harder to defend against. I'll take the company that's got a game plan that has documentation, a risk assessment, and a risk management plan. I'll take that as a client any day.
Yeah, Bob, what are your thoughts?
My managing partner's first question would be, what's the retainer? I mean, this is what we do. I mean, if these, there's no problem. There's no issue defending somebody. I mean, are you going to do it successfully? I don't know. It depends what claims are bought and how bad it is. But generally people don't do things for the purpose of businesses. Do not. I have this another group I'm in. People know it. I won't mention his name, but there's very often a presupposition that companies are actively trying to do the wrong thing. That's not think true. I think companies have varying degrees of resources and varying priorities. And unfortunately, the security very often ends up being a lower priority than keeping the doors open. Yeah. So what you've described is actually a pretty good system, and it's a pretty good opportunity. I'd much rather have that than the evidence that said, no, we really needed the private plane, or no, we decided we were going to spend $50,000 on a retreat for our executives to build morale, something like that. Now, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but this is, it's not a hard, that's not a hard thing to do. I mean,
And to build on what we're talking about here, one of the big things we were working on in our practice are client metrics. When we look at vulnerabilities and we show them to the clients, we're trying to say, look, your IT has been working on this for 6 months, and here's your trajectory, right? And we say, what's that going to look like if you get owned? And so the more we can show those 5 or 10 items that are either showing progress and good faith or not, the more it gets into the executives. And it's really interesting to watch the executives, just look at a graph, same data as we were presenting. Look at the graph and go, what do you mean I've still got 300 critical vulnerabilities across my 100 machines? Why isn't this fixed? And ultimately, and in many cases, the business owner realizes in that moment that this is not IT's problem to solve. It's the business owner's job to tell whoever's responsible for it. Like Stan said, the coach has got to say, or the team captain has got to say, you got to go out and do your job. And the business cannot delegate this. Lawyers cannot delegate this. You have to go say, yeah, we're looking at this metric that doesn't jive anymore. You got to do something about it.
So the buck stops at the top.
The buck stops at the top.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the job is the practitioner's job. And, I applaud Barry having, seen some of his work with us. The practitioner's job is to give you a graphical representation that says where you are and whether you're making progress. Because if you're not making any progress and you can't justify, and I'll go to Sedona conference, you can't justify, oh my God, that's $100,000, then you're going to have a hard time proving that you're doing the right thing. And you know what? It's almost never the $100,000. Data loss prevention, maybe. SIEM, maybe. But can I buy a $300 logging software? Absolutely. Can I use basic data loss prevention in Microsoft for free? Absolutely. These are things of communication and activation. And as Stan says all the time, it's about the leadership. You've got to get the leadership to understand.
Yeah, I think to one degree on that is it almost like there needs to be a teen scared straight experience for CEOs and board members, kind of a situation where, it's like we have these things called tabletop exercises we do with IT, but we only do them with IT. What about the rest of the company? Right. So perhaps that's part of the answer is, taking maybe it's a product offering. Maybe there's a company out there that wants to do that.
That's really interesting because I think that whenever we do tabletops, we're always bringing in. I mean, we can't do a breach response without the top governance people.
Got it.
Yeah. I was going to echo that. I mean, Bob, you're right on. We do tabletops multiple times a month for clients all over the country. It is by definition for us, we don't make it. It's not a technical presentation. It's not designed to point out the technical holes in your environment. It's designed to get the entire organization on board. We've got management, we've got HR, we've got marketing. We've got every aspect of the company and their incident response team, because that is how this is trending away. And going back to a very earlier conversation, this is not an IT issue. This is transcended beyond an IT issue. This is now a full organization that impacts every aspect of the company, and that's really how it needs to be approached.
Yeah. But I'm curious, is the board as well as the C-suite and the ownership involved in those exercises as well?
So in my exercise, generally not the board. it is generally the IR team and the upper management. Now, however, I fully expect if you look at the proposed rules, the SEC disclosure rules, they're actually having you disclose the cybersecurity expertise of your board. And I think because of that, we're going to see a lot more, at least for publicly traded companies, focused at the board level, the cybersecurity knowledge and training.
Yeah, interesting. On the flip side of that, and then we're going to begin to wrap up. We've had situations where the damage was done long before it got to IT notifying management that there was a problem. So we've conducted tabletops of the IT people and management to make sure that IT and management are on the same page. When does when do we want management to get involved? And oftentimes that's because we've not, had management sit down and be active participants of the incident response plan. It's like they threw it over the wall to IT or, and IT thought they were doing great, but nobody connected those dots yet. Yeah. Yeah. It's moving on top of the hour. Let's begin to wrap it up. I want to ask each of you just, couple of what are the key points you want your customer, your client, those executives, what's the one or two most important things you want them to hear? Let me start. I'll start with you, David, because you're the person to join the panel last.
So for me, pick a framework, get started, move forward, track your progress.
Oh, very good. Well done. Well said. Barry.
I'm sorry, I was having trouble unmuting.
Yeah.
I think it really starts with leadership, and I've got a takeaway from this meeting. In fact, I just wrote down a number one, which was really interesting to me. I'm dealing with a merger and an acquisition, and I'm thinking that if we're going to start with that thing, you start planning for what's the end state, and then move backwards. What do we have to have in place at this date? And some of that can be reversed. I mean, say in the security perspective, we said, maybe what I should be starting with is even before the risk assessment, let's start with a breach response tabletop and get the senior management involved. And then we say, okay, now we got buy-in. And then let's start with the risk assessment and move backwards into do the risk assessment, do the plan, make sure there's going to be evidence and build the metrics as David points out. But it might be a better way to start by saying, let's get senior management involved first, and then in a practical way, and then start moving the other direction. And this is what I've taken away from this conversation, as opposed to what I can bring to the conversation. I appreciate it.
No, that's a cool point. Good point. Alex, go ahead. What are your one or two?
I would say, first of all, it's helping clients look at data in a different way, that it's a strategic asset, that it's valuable, and not that it's just something that you have that's a byproduct of being in business that, is a nuisance, right? Like there's a great book by a guy named Niraj Davar. It's called Tilt, and it's basically when the era of big data started. He looked at some enterprise case studies of how large companies like UPS and the airline companies were ingesting all this big data and then looking at it and getting to a place of prescriptive analytics on how to transform their businesses, right? A small business can do that as a microcosm of that kind of strategy, right? But it starts with thinking of data as a strategic asset, right? And I think that will help people understand that I need to protect this the way I protect my finances, the way I protect my household, and every other kind of valuable in my life, right? And then having a healthy risk relationship with that, with data, right? And then you telling more stories. I think stories help. Like I could see why the tabletop would be effective. It's a way to immerse people into the trauma of that kind of experience without actually have them live through a real one, right? So yeah, I just think dumbing things down. And I also hope Rob and I were chatting in the chat about this. I think the general public should put pressure on companies and the government by extension that our data needs to be protected because of that understanding that our data is valuable to me as a consumer and as a person in business, right? So.
Cool. Very interesting perspective. Sadly, we've lost Scott. He had to jump off for a 2:00 meeting. We're running a little late. So Bob, you got to represent both. The entire legal community is now resting on your shoulders, Bob. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it kind of explains what's wrong with the world. Everyone said a lot of good things in a lot of ways. I end a lot of my presentations on privacy and security by saying, by quoting, I forget who it was. It said, if you spend less on cybersecurity than you do on coffee, you'll be hacked and you deserve it. I'd say it's kind of like that. I like all these ideas, but it's time to take this seriously. And the companies that survive will be the companies that do take it seriously.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah. Somebody asked me years ago, what are we going to do here in cybersecurity? And I said, Dennis, we're culling the herd. And sadly, I think that's part of what's going on, which is a segue off to you, George. How do we keep the herd sustainable? How do we keep from going extinct? What are your final couple of thoughts? Yeah.
Take the simple Simon approach like David did. Conduct a legal regulatory impact assessment of both privacy and security first. Period. That will tell you what you're doing next, which will almost always include some of the things that David said. So yeah, that's the only I would append to what David said. Conduct a legal regulatory impact assessment first. Mm-hmm. Know what your exposure and your risk position is. And the data suggests that those who don't do that first spend 58% more. So if you want to spend 58% more on your cybersecurity, then don't conduct a legal regulatory impact assessment. That's just data. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Oh, and of course, get it connected with your community, like Secure the Village. That's mm-hmm. got to be there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the little shout out as well. I mean, I'm reminded of two quotes. One's if you don't know where you are, a map won't help. Yeah, it's like do that initial assessment. And the other is a great quote from our favorite baseball catcher, Yogi Berra. If you don't know where you're going, when you get there, you'll be lost. So kind of carry those two thoughts in mind at the same time. This has been great. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Scott and Jason as well, who had to drop off before we finished. Fabulous discussion. Irina, hopefully you're seeing how truthfully complex this stuff is, but do reach out. Happy to, and others have said as well, happy to have some one-on-one and help you navigate through what you've got to do. Because ultimately, those are that's when the rubber meets the road, is when one person gets, okay, I got it, I understand it, I can move forward on it. Whether that one person is a sole proprietor, is the CEO of a $50 million company or a $500 million company, or that one person, is Aunt Mary who doesn't understand any of this, but she's on Facebook all the time and is really worried. For all of that. So we got to help everybody. Thank you all. Secure the Village is here. We will continue to do these and do more as we move forward into 2023. As I said, we want to start a Ask the Expert series where people will be able to ask one-on-one questions of professionals like us and unprofessionals like some of us, whatever we happen to be. And so thank you all very much, panelists, all the attendees, and our partners, Bay Area IT, Innovation for the Benefit of Humanity, the California Lawyers Association, and especially our platinum sponsor, David Miller Kaplan. We're grateful to all of you.